focus on doing individualized advocacy, where I will do systematic advocacy. So I work with the healthcare providers, I work with the law enforcement, the fire department, social security, social services, Department of Human Services, the prison systems, and I educate them about communication access to be sure that we avoid breakdowns and the creation of barriers in communication. That way, there will be a reduction of problems with people in the community saying, they want to schedule an appointment with the doctor already knows they should be providing an interpreter. If a person is hard of hearing, they can provide some level of assistive listening device, which we call ALD for short. There's a variety of options. And the job is really fun. I absolutely enjoy it. I did do a role as the individual advocate, but now I've been promoted to doing systematic advocacy. The interpreter spoke. Now, mind you, if you have any questions during my presentation, please throw them in the chat. I would try my best to keep an eye on them, or you can hold your questions to the end. I'm happy to answer them either way. Thank you so much. All right, let's continue. So I want to start with this picture here. You see this? In this image, they're watching a baseball game, and you see the three boys. One boy on the left is tall enough where they're able to see the game very clearly. The middle boy can barely get his neck over the fence, but is still able to see the game, barely. And then the third boy to the far right is too short and is not able to see the game at all. And so if there's a hit, a fly ball, a strike, a ball, this poor kid has no idea what's going on. So I want to make a comment about this and how it applies to our community with the deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing and late deafened people. The little boy on the far right who are not able to see the game, that's very similar to many people in my community where we have no access to information. Communication's happening around us, but because we cannot hear it, we don't have any accommodations available to us, and so we have no clue as to what's happening around us and what's being said. We have to ask, and that's a lot of work for us, which is quite frustrating, and the communication is less than beneficial. The person in the middle could be a hard of hearing person who has very limited access to information, maybe can do well in a one-on-one situation, depending on their lip reading skills, but in a group, it would be almost impossible to follow the conversation within the group. And so they're barely getting by, like the boy, who's watching the game. Maybe if something happens right in front of the fence in front of him, he might be too short to see it. And then, of course, the taller kid is like a hearing person who has access 100% to the information around us. And they're able to glean what's going on in the world and have open access to all information. Now, the next picture shows some accommodations that have been provided. So what we see here is the shortest boy has 2 boxes to stand on to allow him to see the game finally. And again, how this applies to our community, say a doctor appointment is been made at the doctor's office with a deaf patient. I would like to get an interpreter, so I can request. It's their responsibility to provide, and they say, sure, of course, I will provide that, which allows me access, and I have the information at my hands. Again, in our community, we do have to ask for the information and request for our need as an interpreter with ASL, American Sign Language. And I want to emphasize ASL. Why? Because I've had experiences in New Mexico where I say, I need an interpreter, but that's all I said. I show up to my appointment and the interpreter's there, and I'm like, I've never seen you before in my life. Then I realized it's a Spanish interpreter who speaks Spanish, and I'm not a hearing person. The Spanish doesn't do anything for me. So I have to be sure when I make my request, I have to say I need an ASL interpreter. I think they just made the assumption because of my name, Gutierrez, Corina. It is a Spanish name, so they assumed that I would have needed a Spanish spoken language interpreter, which was incorrect and not a great assumption. So I have to be very, very clear about what I want and what my communication access needs are. Now, in the third photo, this is the ideal world, absolute utopia, fenced in, everybody has access to everything that's happening on the field. And for me, it would be wonderful if an interpreter is everywhere. The access is always available, or captioning is there. FM system set up for hard of hearing communities, a loop system based for hard of hearing communities. Being able to go into a restaurant, maybe servers know how to use sign language, can ask what I want to eat or drink. I can sign my response. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful, ideal world. But if that will ever happen, no idea. Maybe one day in the long time future. But I do see more and more at restaurants that people are approaching and saying, hey, I know a little bit of sign language. And I say, perfect. Before, I never encountered that. We have to write or point things out on the menu. But these days, they know just enough sign language, and I'm able to speak back to them because, oftentimes the receptive skills are more challenging. It's a lot easier for a person to express because they can say, I know a little sign language, my name is, and spell it out. But if I sign very quickly and say my name is, they'll be like, whoa, 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 slow, 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 please, please, please. And so it's, something I see very often. So I have to make sure I kind of switch my mode and slow down and say my name and spell it out. Make sure that they understand me clearly. I'm sorry, I digress. But yeah, going back to the third picture, that would be the ideal world. And I hope one day, maybe in 50 or 100 years, we'll get to that. Can't really say for sure. I do think it's very important for you to be aware that this picture does apply to our community and what we experience on a daily basis. I mean, we're in 2021 right now. Things should be so much easier as far as getting access and providing for our individual needs. But it's really difficult. Even still, we struggle and we fight and we plead and ask for accommodations. And I say, I need this accommodation or I need that. And it's just over and over. So even today, it's still a struggle for us. And we are continuing to experience discrimination and oppression. And I do think that's something for you to keep in the back of your minds. To be very mindful and compassionate to being able to provide accommodations and honor the request for people's needs. All right. We're going to switch interpreters real quick.
Great. I want to move into talking about identity. Give me in the chat, whether either in the chat or go ahead and open your mic and tell me, what is the definition of identity? What does deaf mean to you? Deaf. Oh, my apologies. Give me a moment with my PowerPoint. They're saying that somebody who cannot hear. Are there any other comments? Any other definitions that you have? Member of the deaf community? Okay. Deaf is obviously a person. Oh, let me see. I see another comment. Unable to hear spoken language. Also, deaf is a person who cannot hear. That's what that means. There are two different groups of communities. There's those who, obviously both of them cannot hear, but the communities are divided. There's one, a signing community, who uses sign language for communication in general to communicate with people, and other people who have deafness, an auditory loss, but are able maybe still to speak, or they don't sign as fluently in American Sign Language for communication, and that group can still identify themselves as deaf because they don't hear. Now tell me, what do you think is the definition for deafblind? Can't hear or see. Others? No other offerings? Deafblind is a person who is not able to hear and visually can't see, but understand that there are different variations along the continuum of vision loss. There may be just a field of loss where you don't have peripheral vision, or you have a narrowed view. Your field of view might be tunnel vision, where you don't see the outside, just a very narrow tunnel in the middle, or complete blindness. Blindness in one eye and not the other. Could be a variety of configurations for that vision loss. A deafblind person, their need for access varies, obviously. They'll still need an interpreter, a one-on-one interpreter. For example, if they have a field of vision loss and they can still see the interpreter seated just a distance from them, that may work. They could sit across from this interpreter and be able to still see this interpreter. I've also worked with deaf-blind folks who have a narrowed field of vision, and they work through Zoom or video phone conferencing, other kinds of devices that are available for access for deaf-blind. And it's called point-to-point, where a deaf-blind person might see me with this, without this background. They don't need the background. It's not effective for them to understand my sign language with this background, and my purple shirt for sure with the green background might not be good for somebody with a visual impairment, but I might have a blackboard behind me, could be a blue or a gray background. Those are the three that work the best. And for my shirt, it needs to be a dark color, solid black, blue, gray, in a similar fashion. Not white. White would be too bright and distracting to the eyes if you wore that as a white shirt. Somebody who has tunnel vision, a deaf-blind person who just has a very narrow field of view, cannot have the interpreter sit right up close, because then they would only see just the face in that field. So the interpreter needs to sit back enough that their hands are visible, and the deaf-blind person can see a field of space that's a large box around that person, so I could see it all above the head and around to the side. So it depends on whether the person is also tracking, and they may need tactile interpreting. If their vision loss is such that it's too blurry to see sign language, or they're completely blind, they may use tactile sign language interpreting with their interpreter. Now, let me know what you think is a good definition for hard of hearing. What does hard of hearing mean to you? Okay, it says impaired with some functioning of hearing. Others? What do you think is hard of hearing? Have access to some hearing. Excellent. I love your contributions. I appreciate those. Now, a hard of hearing person is a person who can hear speech, to some degree. However, the sound might not be complete. There might be pieces missing. It might be a little fuzzy. So they have a hearing loss such that in that community of hard of hearing people, maybe they were born hearing and lost their hearing over the years, or maybe it just started out hard of hearing to begin with. But there are various groups of people, like I mentioned, that first group, a hard of hearing group who maybe has had hard hearing loss their whole life and they can sign and they can speak as well, and that other group who does not know sign language because maybe spoken English is their first language, and they've habituated to using spoken language, even though they do miss out on some of the auditory information. A hard of hearing category of people who start to lose their hearing over the years tend to deny that hearing loss. They may say, "Oh, no, I'm hearing. I just don't identify as a hard of hearing person," and they sort of avoid connecting with that community, and they struggle with their understanding. They ask people to repeat themselves. They maybe don't advocate, or they may have to ask somebody to speak louder, but they often do not advocate for themselves, and they shy away. It's a smaller circle of friends that they tend to trust and are able to navigate within. What is your definition of late deafened? What is your understanding of late deafened? No ideas, any comments? Maybe you're not sure what that means. Oh, okay. Hearing loss due to age. Let me see some of your other comments. Yes. Hearing loss later in life. Somebody who loses their hearing loss at a more advanced age. Good. Excellent. Right, many of you seem to understand that this is a hearing loss that happens later in life. Excellent. This kind of hearing loss happens later, often to seniors, right? Senior citizens as they age, or people who are involved in the Army and have lots of explosive and concussive resulting hearing loss. Also young children who listen to really loud music and they think it's fantastic at a concert or on their headphones, but they don't realize it contributes to hearing loss later in life. Caution your kids not to listen to loud music, would you? So, late deafened. Now, speech disabled. What are your thoughts about what that means? Speech disabled. Okay. An impairment with speech and communication. Some kind of difficulty speaking, maybe dyslexia or some other kind of speech impairment. Good, good. Excellent. You're on the right track. Right. Somebody maybe has difficulty speaking, maybe their larynx or voice box was removed, or they had cancer of the throat, or they had an accident of some nature that damaged their ability to speak. Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to respond into the chat. I think it's really important for you to understand that there are different categories of individuals, and how they identify with their hearing loss and their needs are really important because their access for communication needs are not the same. They're varied based upon their abilities. Now I'd like for you to comment about giving hearing loss a name. Here are some 3 different labels: hearing impaired, deaf mute, and deaf and dumb. I want to talk about the last 2 first. Some of those words you still see, and they are from long ago, and they still sort of pop up. But today in 2021, you may still hear somebody say deaf mute. Is that person deaf mute? Are they deaf and dumb? Sometimes they'll say deaf and dumb because they can't also speak. We see that occasionally still. Hearing impaired, though, that first option, unfortunately, it's used every day in the medical settings, anywhere in the academic environment, legal settings, pretty much everywhere. It's ubiquitous in use of that term, hearing impaired. But our community dislikes that label because impaired, that word in itself implies that something needs to be fixed. And we feel that we don't need to be fixed. I'm going to fix my hearing or fix my speaking. No, I'm deaf, or I may be deafblind or hard of hearing. And we have our own way of identifying ourselves through culture and language, whether it's sign language, and we're content with who we are. But it's the outside political bodies that are giving that label and assigning it to us, wondering what to call our group of people, and they call us hearing impaired. They don't bother to ask the community what we think is a more politically correct label for ourselves to identify our community. Instead of using that, a more appropriate label might be some of these below. These are more appropriate words to use. Hard of hearing. And there's deaf with a capital D and a deaf with a lowercase d. It matters. The uppercase D is a person who generally signs, who's involved in the deaf community, and has a very strong ability to affiliate and navigate with sign language, like myself. I call myself a big D deaf because I grew up going to deaf schools. I graduated from there, went to Gallaudet University. Gallaudet University is itself the only deaf liberal arts university in the United States. So, of course, everybody signs there in the deaf flock there because the teachers can sign and we have direct communication in our classrooms. We don't need interpreters in the classrooms there. We just go to class and mingle like everybody else. It's a strong community of deafness, and the deaf culture is inherent in the way that we live our life there. So I'm a big D deaf person. Now, the little d refers to a group of people who maybe have late deafened, they became deaf later, they're not involved in our community. Their first language is a spoken English or some spoken language, and it's a little d deaf. Now, I have another question for you. I'm sure many of you have already heard or seen the word hearing impaired out in the world, right? Have you seen that, hearing impaired? Yes? No? Let me know in the chat. Do you see hearing impaired used out there a lot? Right. Most people say yes, that they see or hear that, and maybe you're surprised to hear me say that we shouldn't be using that, but it's so frequently used, right? I hope it is a surprise, because I don't want you to use those terminology anymore, hearing impaired, deaf mute, deaf and dumb, because that's the medical community that often tries to use that, and we're trying to encourage a transition from using these more oppressive words to more adaptive, self-identified words that the community has decided. Now, in the United States, I think it just happened in Utah, they passed a law to eliminate the word of hearing impaired throughout all of their state documents and such. So I'd like to, if other states would follow that model, I hope our deaf organization will continue working towards that in order to help eliminate those oppressive words such as hearing impaired from legal, academic, medical settings, so that they're no longer using those oppressive words. And maybe eventually that'll move on and be taken up by other states. For those of you here working with the deaf community, I encourage you to try to eliminate the use of that word and identifying the community as hearing impaired. And I ask them how they want to be identified. If they say they're deaf, if they're hard of hearing, then go ahead and use their terminology rather than reflecting on them as part of hearing impaired.
Yes, we're good. Now I want to talk about language. You'll see 3 different languages here. We have English, Spanish, and ASL. I'm going to show you the English word sentence. You can see it says, I have a red car. And that's already established with English rules, the word order, you have the verb, you have an adjective, you have nouns and adverbs, and all the rules that apply to spoken English. Now let's move over to Spanish. Oh, sure. Can't see. Okay, there we go. The word is Spanish, and I use this because, our state of New Mexico, the second official language here is Spanish. And I didn't think about it, but there's so many different languages that are used there. We have Japanese, Filipino, etc., etc. So for now, I'm just using Spanish as an example. So you have tengo un coche rojo. I think the interpreter can try to interpret that properly. And it's the same idea as English. They already have their rules, word order, and the rules between English and Spanish are quite different. Now, I can write and communicate with written Spanish quite well, but I want to show you the ASL version. Red car, me have. You might look at that and say, wow, that's broken English. And you might think, oh my, it's wrong, but it is not a written language. It's a visual language. And that's how we communicate using ASL. It's very clear in a visual sense. Red car I have, and that's how I would sign it. And that is considered correct. It is our language, our structure, our rules, our word order, which makes it correct. I do think it's really important for you to understand that when you are working with a deaf individual or individuals, maybe there's no interpreter that is provided or showed up, and you look at their writing, you might think, oh my goodness, their writing is horrible. That's not necessarily true. They might be putting their sign language in written English. Now, some people, wait, let me clarify. I need to back up a moment. Some deaf people have low reading and writing skills. They struggle with literacy, maybe up to a third grade reading level, which would mean that with their communication using writing, you will see it like this, and it may seem awful to you when you read it, but really and truly it's not. It's just their best way of expressing themselves because they're so accustomed to signing ASL that they use the same order of how they would sign it in the written language. Now, when you're communicating with them with pen and paper and they're writing to you in ASL, you may need to try your best and then respond. And when they read the English, maybe they don't understand some of the words. They may struggle with the language or vocabulary. Do you think if this is the case, it's an effective means of communication? I would say no, because it could lead to quite a few misunderstandings. And, you may feel like it's broken English, but it's not. And, you just have to remember that their first language is American Sign Language, and that you have to maybe change your perception a little bit. Realize that communication is maybe not being so successful. And you may want to offer an interpreter for them, which could improve the communication, because interpreters could close that gap. But I'll explain more about that later. I just wanted to be sure that you understand that there are differences between English and American Sign Language, as well as other languages that you may hear in your state. There's so many variances. So I want to talk about deaf behavior now. In order to get a deaf person's attention, you can wave your hand so that they'll turn and look at you. Now, I want to emphasize, please do not go right into their face and wave your hand in front of them, because that's pretty disruptive. And, we all need to have our personal space. And if you come too close, that's no good. Very inappropriate. So at your distance, wave. If you're not able to get the person's attention, you may ask somebody nearby if they would tap the deaf person on the shoulder. The right way to do it is right here in the shoulder area, maybe in the elbow, but not so much, and not on the leg or on the top of the head. No, no. On the back, that's pretty rude. Again, we're looking at personal space. So right at the shoulder is the most appropriate. And, don't jab at them. Just gently tap either side, right or left. And generally that will get their attention and they won't feel, scared out of their wits, And if you really jab on their shoulders, it can be quite frightening. Say in a classroom, if you're a teacher in a classroom, you may feel a tapping of the vibration if you tap on the table, and they may look up from whatever it is that they're doing. I wanted to add one more thing. You can get their attention by flickering the lights in the room. So you just flash them off and on really quick. Just not really fast where it's, going to trigger a seizure or something. But, just gently off and on a couple of times and they'll look up. I do know that in a home environment with a family, say maybe I have 2 or 3 deaf family members, and I also have a mix of hearing family members. Oftentimes, they'll flicker the lights and the deaf members will look, and sometimes the hearing folks will be like, "What are you doing?" And perhaps they don't really understand that deaf culture, and that's our way of getting a deaf person's attention, or actually walking up to them and tapping them on the shoulder. Now, you don't have to run and chase down a person if they're, on the opposite end of a large room. Because, if you flicker the lights off and on too often, it could, interrupt the hearing members of the family. And then I think it just takes some time to explain that this is why I'm doing this. In a school environment, you just make sure you educate on that being the deaf culture of how we get a deaf person's attention. Deaf voice, well, for me, I have never learned how to speak. Never. Lip reading, yeah, I did take speech therapy to learn, but honestly, I was quite rebellious because I'm, totally deaf. I don't hear a thing. So why should I learn how to speak? But, my parents and the medical professionals said that, I could be taught to speak, but no, I can't. So deaf voice means, if I try to say something, it probably will make no sense whatsoever. People would not understand me. And many times we get made fun of for that. And please don't mock us, because that's awful. Many of us have not learned to speak or didn't do very well at it. I could say, hey, that you could probably understand and maybe have, your attention. Mama, I could do that because it's something I've said. Papa, throughout my lifetime, I could say those things. But in general conversation, I am so not fluent. I'm deaf. I have a tendency to not use my voice at all. I could yell to get someone's attention. I know oftentimes, like with my partner who can hear, I will say, hey, and they'll say, well, why didn't you just come and tap me on the shoulder? Because when they want my attention, because if I'm upstairs and my partner's downstairs, they have to come all the way up to get my attention. Sometimes if I could see the light flickering from where I'm at, then I know, oh, okay, maybe I need to come downstairs and find out what's going on. So I've learned not to yell out, hey, I have to get on my feet, walk down the stairs, or flicker the lights to get their attention. Okay, let's move down. With the second part, when it comes to questions, say, for example, in a courtroom, they may present a question, and the deaf person will go on and on and on and give a very, very elaborate answer, even though the question could be very simply answered by saying, yes, I was there, or no, I don't know what happened. But deaf people have a tendency to go on and kind of fall through that rabbit hole. But the key is we have to remember that we've been oppressed throughout life and haven't had very much opportunity to share. And so when we have it, we take advantage of saying all the things that have built up in us for the times that we weren't able to. So it's very important to just hear them out. They will eventually get to the answer. And then facial expressions. That is very crucial for you to know that within American Sign Language, we use facial expressions every day. It's part of our language. And all of the facial expressions have a meaning behind it. Similarly for you, when you are speaking, when you're looking or hearing a tone of voice, which will indicate your happiness if it's high. If you're sad, it tends to be lower. If you're angry, it goes back high. So with ASL, our facial grammar applies to emotion. So we'll sign a little bit bigger if we're excited, and a little faster if we're sad. We'll sign smaller. We'll have a more subdued look on our face, where you might say, my mom is mad at me. I'm in trouble. I'm so stupid. You're signing very small. When you're angry, the signing space gets big and quick, and you're breathing heavy. You can see the nostrils, and that will show the equality of what a tone would be in a spoken language. Now, speaking about hearing people who use the facial expressions, remember though, we use them every day in the deaf community. So when we're working and around hearing people, they tend to roll their eyes at us, which shows me that they're really impatient with me at the moment. And we do rely on the facial expressions quite a bit. I don't feel real collaboration without it if a person is impatient and unwilling to work with us. I have experience dealing with people who they roll their eyes, a deaf person, and they'll switch out to someone else because they don't want to deal with me. And then I wonder, whatever happened to that person? I'll ask why, and they just kind of brush it off. Are they just unwilling to work with me because I'm a deaf person? That's the assumption that I make, but I don't like how that feels, that you just switched out to another person, representative. But, if the second one is friendly and willing to work with me and provide great customer service, very hospitable, that's okay too. So just be really careful about how you express yourself and your facial expressions when you're dealing with a deaf and hard of hearing person. Now, talking about the quote-unquote deaf nod, it doesn't mean they're saying yes. Not always. They're just saying, okay, I'm catching what you're saying, but maybe they don't understand you and they just nod anyways, despite having no clue what's being said. And, they're stressing now, and especially in a high stress situation, oftentimes they will not say anything. But if they're nodding their head, it could give the impression that they're following along and in agreement. But that's not always the case. I've worked a lot with my clients, and they will say, I nodded my head throughout the presentation. I have no idea what they were saying. I don't know what they were talking about. I asked, is there an interpreter? They said yes. And I said, well, why aren't you not understanding? Why didn't you ask for clarity? And they said, it was very stressful. It was overwhelming. I needed to have somebody there. Even though there was an interpreter, they needed additional support. Maybe the interpreter wasn't the best fit for the consumer. That's always a possibility. So, there needs to be clarifications. It's important to check in and say, do you understand what I'm saying? Do you understand what's going on? Because oftentimes they keep nodding their head. So you may need to check for understanding. Ask them to repeat what they believe the message is, and have them try to express what their understanding is. And you may recognize that they really didn't understand. And that's where patience and that interaction comes into play. And I've already explained about the differences in the emotions and how it affects the signing size and speed. It doesn't mean that this person is out of control or a danger. They're just expressing their feelings of maybe frustration and anger or hurt. and they will sign larger and faster. Just hear them out, and do not feel threatened. You don't need to run for help. Now, if they're really trying to hurt you, that's a different story.
There are a variety of ways. Great. There are a variety of ways of communication. 3 that I want to cover here: sign language communication, lip reading, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and then writing back and forth. Now, writing back and forth, again, there are different groups of deaf people who struggle to communicate with skills in reading and writing, so writing back and forth might not really be very effective for them. But for some, a deaf person who has great reading and writing skills may navigate with writing back and forth just fine without the need of an interpreter. So it depends on the time and the place. Of course, it takes a lot more time to go back and forth when you're writing. Or if you're able to use a computer or a laptop that has a quicker ability to type, but still keep in mind writing back and forth is going to take much more time. If you have an interpreter, a sign language interpreter, then it will take less of your time to get effective communication occurring. I just want to make sure that I'm on track with my interpreter. Okay, so basic communication principles.
Good morning, Comprehensive Service Center. This is Ross. Hey, hi. No, I'm not. I'll be home. Let's see, what is today? Wednesday. I should be home around 6. Oh, Saturday I'm home. Yep, pretty much. Sure. Sure, that sounds great. Okay, are you able to email me that beforehand so I can look it over? Yes. Oh, okay. 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 All right. Thank you very much. All right. Bye.
services because they don't like that kind of struggle. And so trying to encourage them, even though we're having to keep that 6-foot distance, find some other ways that we can kind of navigate that communication barrier. So it may mean that you have to use long distance aids, some kind of assistive device like a tablet or additional voice to text app, so that a hard of hearing person who can speak then can have the other hearing person in the conversation speak into the text app, and the hard of hearing person can read what they said and have a little bit more effective communication and answering back verbally and taking turns doing it in that protocol. That helps with the hard of hearing community to use the voice to text to see what's going on in the conversation. It's really important. Well, it's important to speak clearly in your normal pace, of course. Don't exaggerate your lips and big mouth movements. That only makes it more complicated. Just speak normally in your normal process. If you speak quickly, that's not going to be very helpful. You may hear somebody ask you, do you mind to speak a little bit slower? That might let you know that they have some hearing loss. So slow down so that your speech is clear and see that they're comfortable with the pace you're using. Lastly here, you see these two pictures along the bottom. One's with a fan running in the background. A hard of hearing person who has a hearing aid on is going to hear the noise of that fan and the neighbors, and everything's going to be blurred together when they're trying to grab the information that you're sharing. So try not to communicate in a noisy room with somebody who's hard of hearing. Try to make it a little bit quieter and ask them if they're able to hear you clearly enough in there. Check with them. Is it too loud in here, or is it quiet enough before you move into your conversation? That second photo there of the person with a really bright window behind, and then if I was a deaf person looking at that person in the window, I wouldn't be able to see what the interpreter, if that was the interpreter, what they were saying, because they would be silhouetted. The light needs to be on them. So if you have a blank wall where there's no window glaring right behind the interpreter, that would be best. Put the signer or the interpreter along a clear wall rather than in a bright window, so that their sign language could be visible. Just like right now with this interpreter Gina has a blue background, and you can see her signing in the window, and I can see her clearly. If she didn't have the blue background, it would be very difficult. I don't know whether she's in an office or a house, but there might be a lot of visual noise in the background, and it would be too distracting. I wouldn't be able to track and really focus on this discussion through my interpreter. So having this background visually takes away that visual noise, and I'm able to just cruise along and listen more easily. It's easier on the eyes. Okay. Let's see. Now, whether a person has visual decline or auditory decline, let me go ahead and it's okay to say things like, there's various sentences you might use. You might not understand the first or second time, then try a different approach of explaining something that might make it a little bit more clearly. So rephrasing. Also use your body language or facial expressions to help with the visual communication. For example, in a medical environment, medical setting, if I'm in an appointment with a doctor relative to my shoulder problem, let's say, and I said, gosh, it really hurts, and maybe there's a long word connected to it, like tendonitis, and I'm like, what is that? What you might have is a visual aid in the room where a doctor could bring and show the shoulder and show exactly where that tendon is and how it's supposed to function, and then it's torn there, and it's much more a visual concept of the problem. That will help. It's critical to use any visual aids you have in the setting because we rely on all kinds of visual information. The auditory information isn't there, so the words may not be heard. So visually, we're going to rely on all those things in the environment, all the visual aids and cues that are available, such as a model that gives a better schema for what it is you're trying to explain. And then the interpreter can rely upon that. They're doing a great job. Even with an interpreter, they can still explain what's going on with the shoulder, but the tear and the words, the medical terminology might be too. Klein. Oh, let's say you're smoking and talking, or you have this cigar or cigarette sticking out of your mouth, or if you have a pen between your lips and you're trying to talk. Really difficult for people to speech read in those settings. They won't be able to understand you. And especially now with the masks, it's a huge struggle, not just for the hard of hearing community, but the deaf community as well, because we rely a lot on the facial expressions all over the face that match with the signing. I'll show you what I mean. If I put this on, my mask here, and I say, hey, how are you? It may be that the interpreter is going to have a difficult time deciding. It's very challenging to decide, is my face smiling or upset or happy, because it's a struggle whether you're hard of hearing or deaf with a mask on. Same for a hard of hearing person who relies upon lip reading. They're not able to see the mouth anymore. Watch, I'll show you this here. Even with this kind of a mask. I'll go ahead and switch.
We'll switch interpreters.
Gotcha.
So I could speak here, and perhaps a hard of hearing person could see my lips. So I do encourage you to use a clear mask, which is also something interpreters can use, as well as deaf people. Of course, that mask is very uncomfortable to wear. That plastic sticks to your face, but of course it allows much better communication. So when I'm here in the office and I'm meeting with clients, I will use that mask. It is more accessible. They can see my facial expressions, and the communication not a good idea to lower your mask in order to create better communication. So it is quite challenging. I have already talked about, visual distractions. Oftentimes the hearing person may talk and look away, but when you're working with a hard of hearing person, that is difficult to work with, because if you're looking in other directions, your mouth is moving along with your face, and they're going to have to try to follow along with you, and they're going to have difficulty expressing themselves. They're relying on reading your lips, so being still is important, and hopefully they will advocate for themselves, and they'll ask you to please be still and not walk around and look around the room as you speak, and continue eye contact. As an educator, it's very, very challenging because, they're looking at the board, looking in one direction, another person, and a hard of hearing person really struggles because they're behind you, but you're speaking into the board. So the key is to be very considerate as you're writing on the board. Hold off on what you're saying, and then begin when you turn around and face the classroom to allow a hard of hearing student to understand what you're saying. For men who have very full beards, long mustaches that cover their lips, that makes it quite difficult. Maybe you need to, manscape, kind of clean up around the mouth. I mean, if it's a long, heavy beard from the chin, that's fine. But if you're trying to communicate with a hard of hearing person, it could make it very difficult and challenging to read your lips. And lighting is key. You need to have it bright enough. Even on a Zoom meeting, to see the interpreters, they need to be well lit. If it's too dark, I'm struggling, and it's very hard on my eyes. So having a brightly lit room does make all the difference, and it allows for the communication to flow smoothly. Fun fact. And only 30% of English is understandable. Interpreter, I forgot to tell you. But I'm going to ask the interpreter not to speak right now, just for a moment. I'm going to sign something, and I need you to try to lip read it without hearing the voice, okay? There are 3 words that I'm going to sign. The first one I will sign, and there will be no interpretation. You need to guess what the interpreter would say and then put that in the chat. First word. Okay, the interpreter will not be speaking. Oh, who said that? I see the word. How did you get that? I didn't see the interpreter say anything. You saw my finger spelling, huh? Caught it. Oh, okay. That means this isn't going to work. I mean, for those of you who already know some sign language, don't say anything. I want the interpreter to mouth it, but there will be no sound, okay? The interpreter will do that without a voice. Okay. So I'm going to go to the second word. Please, if you know sign language, do not throw out the answer. Hold on. Let me go back and check something really quick. All right, I'm gonna send a message directly to the interpreter. word did you think that was just mouthed by the interpreter? I see please. I see maybe, baby. Well, we did use baby. That was the first one, but the word was maybe. Very good. Okay, one more. And I'm going to send it directly to the interpreter. What did the interpreter just mouth? We've already did maybe, so it's got to be something different. We had baby and maybe, but this is another word. Nobody can guess it. Just take a guess. So difficult. Yes. Okay, so nobody caught this one. What it was, okay, could be save me, yes. What it was is pay me. P-A-Y-M-E. So you can see baby, maybe, pay me looks very, very similar on the mouth. And so when you're speaking and I don't hear you, depending on reading your lips, I could be easily confused. So perhaps I could, look at it in context. I know we're talking about COVID. Maybe I can eliminate some of the possibilities to the one that most fits the topic. But like this says, a person can only understand about 30%, which is a very low percentage. And for myself, as a deaf person, I don't lip read that well. I mean, understand far less. Because when growing up, people can say, can you read lips? That I understand because I saw it growing up. People will tend to ask me, can you read lips? Over and over. That I can read. And my answer will always be no. No. I have to ask for it to be in writing. Or typing or texting, some type of text to communicate. You're the best of and a person who might be very, very skilled at lip reading, right on. Fantastic. If they're comfortable with that, now mind you, it would be like a one-on-one conversation. It would be really difficult in a group setting. There's going to be a lot of misinformation because the speech is quick. They're back and forth, and it's hard to keep up. Now, I've experienced, being in meetings where, say, a treatment team meeting, and everybody's hearing, and they have 2 sign language interpreters part of the room, and I'm the only deaf person. And they're speaking quick back and forth, and I realized at the next meeting, I decided to set up some ground rules, which meant anybody who's facilitating the meeting must identify who wants to speak. So someone has to raise their hand, wait till they're called upon by the facilitator, and they'll say, okay, Corina, go ahead. Then I can make my comment or ask my question, and then another person has to raise their hand. Or you can use some item like a ball and pass it to the person who's speaking. That makes that meeting far more efficient for me. Because, hearing people are so used to speaking fast and responding back and forth, and the interpreters, they're having a hard time. I might ask to interrupt. The interpreters try to interrupt, but there's nowhere that they can get in, and so my access drops. And so we set up the ground rules to make sure that everybody has equal access. Somebody says, OMG. Thank you, I understand. Very good. I want to talk about sign language interpreters right now. I'm trying to check my time. We're going till 3 o'clock, right? Just making sure. I think so. So talking about sign language interpreters, and it's very important that when you are working with deafblind, or hard of hearing people, you speak directly to that person.
But, oh. But.
And it's just a matter of facilitating communication between parties. Like you're seeing today, I'm signing, and the interpreter, Jenny and Gina, are speaking for me as I sign. Now, I may complete my thought, but they need to add more words to finish it for you because ASL and English are different. I can sign something that says many things in a brief 1 or 2 signs, but with the English language, we have to fill in all the blanks with articles and so forth. So you have to pause and give time for the sentence to be completed in a spoken English text. Sometimes interpreters will be interpreting and get too far behind and may, tell me, hold on 1 second, and I'll pause so they can get caught up and then continue my next thought. Like today on Zoom, after I'm done, I wait and I look to see the interpreter stop speaking, and then I'll move on to the next slide. I just can't keep going on and on and on, and the interpreter get further and further behind because we need to work together. They're following me and I'm following them so we can make the process go well. Next. For assignments, there's many different types, and it's really important to indicate what the setting might be. Whether it's a job interview, you let them know, hey, the agency, this is going to be a job interview. Let them know if it's a deafblind or a hard of hearing person. Indicate what type of communication needs they may have. Is it just ASL interpreting, or maybe tactile interpreting, or maybe a person needs a loop system in the room and have that prepared for a hard of hearing person when they come in. It's very important to clarify all the specifics that are needed so that the interpreting agency knows how to best fit the needs of any of the clients. Now you can see here there's 2 different categories. The one on the left, which is in the yellow title, and the orange part is the signer or a family member. So when you're looking at a certified interpreter, they have been certified, they are professional interpreters, they've already been knowledgeable and educated on the Code of Ethics or the Code of Professional Conduct. They've taken training, been certified, and know what their roles and responsibilities are. They're fluent in ASL, they've had enough training, and they know and understand deaf culture. Now, opposing to that, you have a signing person or family member. They are not certified. They do not adhere to the CPC because they've never been trained. They don't even know what the CPC is. And do they understand a role and responsibility as an interpreter? Likely not. They may have limited sign language skills and lack understanding. Like my family members, they're not very fluent. I do have one sibling, my youngest brother, who does sign quite well, and he's a doctor, and he would be able to communicate with deaf patients directly because of his ASL fluency. But sometimes he feels more comfortable having an interpreter coming in to interpret for a deaf patient. And would he interpret for me in my medical appointment? Absolutely not, because he's not certified. Even though he probably could with his fluency, but he doesn't know what it is to be an interpreter the roles and responsibilities. He doesn't know the CPC, and he may understand some deaf culture, not in a broad sense, and that applies to a lot of people.
It's important for you to understand these two different groups and the differences between them. What's really critical to understand in these two different categories of signers and interpreters is never to use signers or family members to interpret. Because obviously the person could never file a complaint against that person being a family member. They could not advocate for themselves. If a certified interpreter failed to perform their role and didn't interpret well or had an unprofessional attitude, there are 7 different tenets that describe the expected behavior of a certified interpreter, and if a consumer didn't feel respected, they could file a complaint with the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or they could report the interpreter to the agency. There are steps in that process. First, the deaf person would say they weren't satisfied with the selection of the interpreter for their appointment because they weren't compatible, it wasn't as successful for helping have effective communication, and they would prefer not to use that interpreter in a future event. That's the easiest way. Or rather than just filing a complaint, they would first inform the agency, but then they could also inform the place itself that I don't want that interpreter at my future appointments here because of the potential for misunderstandings, and I don't want to have a family member. I couldn't file a complaint against them. Nevertheless, if you decided to use a family member to interpret at, say, a medical appointment with me, and the doctor says, you have stage 4 cancer, it's serious, and maybe my mom or my sister starts bawling and crying, and they know the information before, I'm like, what's the matter? What's going on? What did they say? And they're crying already. They're not a neutral party. They're not effectively able to follow the professional code of conduct expected of an interpreter, whereas an interpreter who's certified, following the professional code of conduct, could remain impartial during that interpretation. Of course, internally, they might feel heartbroken on the bad news, but they're not going to start crying and show that initially. They're going to share that information sensitively as the doctor conveys it. Sorry to say that you have stage 4 breast cancer, and allow that person themselves to take it in and decide for themselves their own reactions, whether they're somber or want to cry or have their own breakdown. It's not reliant upon the interpreter and their response first. They need to remain neutral so that the deaf person can have their own experience. Don't use a deaf child to interpret, or a hearing child to interpret for their deaf parents. It's really forbidden, actually. Like, for example, if you call 911 and you show up at a home and both parents are deaf and the children are hearing and you ask what happened, they're already under stress. Can you imagine the trauma for the child to be relied upon to interpret in that urgent situation? Don't do that. They must have an interpreter. Avoid using children in any scenario as interpreters. Now, what the meaning of a qualified interpreter merits discussion because they can interpret effectively and remain neutral. They're able to understand and convey, so they have to effective, accurate, and neutral in their communication. Plus, they should be expert at using the variety of vocabulary, for example, in sign. If an interpreter who is certified in a medical setting, they would have the fluency and the ability, understanding all the medical terminology that would go on during an appointment. For an interpreter who works in the K through 12 school setting, they're familiar with all of the different unique vocabulary that's used in math classes or science classes, and they could conduct themselves. Take that interpreter from a K-12 setting and put them in a legal setting or a courtroom, they would not be qualified in that setting. They would not be able to effectively communicate and accurately convey the information that's being shared. In a court setting, you have to have a legally certified interpreter who's prepared for that setting, or somebody who has a different level of experience and able to interpret in court because they've done it frequently. It's critical to know the qualifications of the interpreter. Are they appropriate for the setting that you're in? And whether it's a good match for the consumer. Here in Hawaii, this is the interpreter, the description of what's required, the certification card in the Hawaii state requirement. They don't have a license. No state licensure required to become an interpreter. They just rely upon the certification that the interpreter already has. This is what it looks like. And I want to show you what it looks like in my state of New Mexico. In New Mexico, we require interpreters to also have a license to interpret. It's mandatory. You'll see at the bottom has two different badges. One of them is green. That's a person who is certified with RID at the national level, and they're able to interpret in the community. The red badge is a temporary or an interim badge. It may mean that they just graduated from an interpreter training program at the university, and they're applying. It's for a provisional license. It takes about 5 years of practice in order to become certified within RID, and then you're able to become a community interpreter or work.
can see them whenever it's their turn to speak. There could be 25 people in the whole meeting, and when you have that many people on screen, each screen is very small. So if I multi-pin 2 interpreters and 5 deaf people, I'm only seeing 7 tiles, which is fine, you know. And all the other people involved are very small along the top of the screen, which is very deaf friendly. It's visually appealing, rather than some of the other platforms like Google Meets or Microsoft Teams. There's several other ones. You know, they're going to always spotlight the person who's speaking. So I might be looking at the interpreter and then they disappear because the speaker changes and I'm not able to pin, multi-pin especially. And I've experienced that already, the frustration, you know, going into the court system using that platform. And I just can't see the interpreter, and the interpreter has to also speak up. And it's not conducive. Sharing once you share the screen, the interpreter's tile gets very, very small. So many of the other platforms are not deaf friendly. For a hard of hearing person, Google Meets is the best fit because of the captioning. The captioning is very clear. They identify each individual who's speaking. And in my experience with the court, I gave up using the interpreter. I just relied completely on the text because I can read and write well. But if we're talking about people whose reading and writing is minimal, that's not going to work. A hard of hearing person, if speaking was their first language, then Google Meets is fine. It's wonderful. The key is to know which platform is best, or the best fit, I should say, for any individual. If a person says they might prefer Zoom, and you may say, hey, Zoom is not very secure, but it is now. In the beginning, when COVID first hit, then you know, it was quite easy to hack in, but they've put in a lot of work and really made efforts to secure their system. And I believe Zoom is the best fit for our community. So it's something that, you know, you should know. Okay. Well, I'm done with my presentation. Do you have any questions or comments? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen at this point. If someone wants to turn their camera on and speak out their question or comment, that's fine. Otherwise, you can use the chat. Don't be shy. I hope my training was beneficial to you all and that you've learned something new and feel comfortable and working with our community and improving your relationship with them. And, you know, I'm talking about the community in Hawaii. No comments? That's it? Oh, thank you. Any good online sources for providers? For whom exactly? Just any specific, because it's pretty broad. If we're talking education related, that means you would want to go at the National Deaf Education Center, ADEC, and I think people who here, I think I'm assuming are in education, no? Medical, okay, telehealth. Let me think about this. With telehealth, it's very difficult to use because oftentimes you cannot have a third connection. But here in New Mexico, I don't know about Hawaii, but we have to fight here to make sure that we get an interpreter involved in that conversation. They say, no, because of HIPAA. Well, I understand about HIPAA, but the key is we need an interpreter. The interpreters have already been trained. They know their CPC. Many have been, you know, very well trained repeatedly on what HIPAA is. And without the interpreter, telehealth is not going to work. it would probably have to be a in-office appointment. Deafblind, telehealth is absolutely worthless. That has to also be an in-person visit, especially if they're relying on tactile interpreting without live person. It's not going to work. As far as other sources, I can look for them. Oh, I see Roz.
Hi. So the CSC website does have some resources for professionals. If you go to our homepage and scroll down a little bit, there's some circles there that say I am deaf, I am hard of hearing, and there's also one that says professionals, and then you just click on that and that'll take you to a bunch of resources. You can also contact us, ask any questions. Karina also mentioned telehealth for deafblind. We do have a program called Support Service Provider Program that is for the deafblind community. So for those who are a part of that, they can have their SSP with them and then do telehealth that way. So that is something that is available to the community. It's a free service for deafblind individuals. So if you know anyone who might be interested, then I encourage you to have them contact us and apply for that. I realize I'm looking at the wrong screen because my Zoom's over there, but my camera's over here. Sorry.
I do also want to add, with what Raj just mentioned about an SSP. It's a support services provider. And that person is going to guide a deaf-blind person, will accompany them, drive them places, to appointments or grocery shopping. If the person is totally blind, they will ask what type of food, they'll describe the labels and provide communication to what's around visually and let them know what's happening in their surroundings. Maybe a person's walking by or that there's a dog barking. Here in New Mexico, we do have a program for SSP to our deafblind community, but they're not allowed to interpret because many of us have requirements for licensure, and that interpreters have to have a license. So SSP is not able to do that. They just accompany them, give them information. But when it's an actual meeting or an appointment, they would need to use a certified interpreter, and an SSP will have to step back, let the interpreter do their job. Once that's completed, everything's done, then the SSP will take over and take the deafblind person wherever they need to go.
That's correct for Hawaii as well. The SSPs do not interpret. You're right.
All right. Okay. Is there any more questions, comments, or are we done? Everybody finished? I want to thank all of you for your time and participation, your willingness to learn and contemplate, and maybe take a look at how you have performed and how you can make changes as you move on, and have that empathy, compassion, and respect, and have fun. It's really important. Don't be afraid. Don't be nervous. There's no harm. Just be out there. And I see Christina and Chesney. Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you. Very nice to see your faces. I'm happy to see you turn your cameras on. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Karina, for being here today and for sharing all of this very valuable information. Many people have asked whether or not the PowerPoint will be available to them after this. Is that something that I can share? No. Okay.
No.
Okay, no problem. So if anyone has any other questions,
Well,
what was that?
Well, I do know that the PowerPoint could be shared in a PDF with Roz. I think that could be disseminated for review. Yeah.
Okay, so don't share it in PowerPoint form, is what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay, no problem. So I will be converting that to a PDF and then sending that to everyone.
No. I did that already. It's already a PDF that I sent you yesterday.
Perfect. Okay. So I will be sharing that with everyone. And then I'm also going to be emailing you an evaluation. So if you could please fill that out for us, that's very important for our reporting so that we can continue workshops like these. And then when you fill out that evaluation, there'll be a link to download your certificate of participation. Okay. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email us. We're happy to pass those along to Karina. And thank you so much again for being here today. And we look forward to seeing you all again later. Bye.
It was my pleasure, and thank you to the interpreters, both of them, to interpret my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you, Gina and Jenny.
It was a lot of work for the interpreters. It's done.
That's why we always ask for the best. And then we also want to thank the cart provider as well. Thank you. Bye.